welcome to the Podcast of the Damned. I'm your host, Ian, and in today's minisode, we're talking about the 2010 movie, A Serbian Film. Now, the Podcast of the Damned is a horror podcast that deep dives into a different topic every single week in our quest to create a leaderboard of the best and worst horror movies of all time. That is how the main show goes, but here on the YouTube channel, on the Patreon, we do these minisodes, 10-15 minute episodes, where we give you a brief overview of a movie that either we don't really plan on covering on the main show or something that's a new release and that, you know, we might cover down the line in the future. Today, like I say, we're talking about the highly controversial A Serbian Film. Now, before I get into this episode, if you are someone who has suffered from sexual abuse, if you're someone who has issues with like sexual abuse, domestic abuse, suicide, things like that, this is not a movie for you. If any of those things affect you and you are affected by those issues, please take this as your warning to do not go and watch this movie. If, of course, those things don't bother you and you're into the more extreme side of horror, then by all means go check out this movie. But I'm going to give a brief overview of A Serbian Film. It was released in 2010, directed by Serdan Spasojevic. I am going to butcher these names, guys, I'm sorry. Sergeant Spasojevic, Sergeant Todorovic, Sergei Trifonovich, and Yelena Gavrilovich. I think I did not too bad there. The IMDb plot of this movie is as follows. An aging porn star agrees to participate in an art film in order to create a clean break from the business, only to discover that he has been drafted into making a paedophilia and necrophilia themed snuff film. The tagline for this movie: not all films have a happy ending. This movie certainly doesn't. I don't really... There's so much to talk about with this film. It's such a controversial movie. It's gained such notoriety over the years for the subject matter that, you know, that takes place in this movie. And I think it's such a difficult one for me to really get into, because on the one hand, there are aspects, if you purely are looking at this movie from a technical standpoint, right? You're not looking at the subject matter, you're looking at exactly what happens and what you get to see on screen. There are positive aspects to this movie. There are 100% positive aspects to this film. It's not, you know, the cinematography of it is decent. It's got a pretty nifty soundtrack. The acting is fine. You know, this is not like some real sort of B movie where, you know, everything in it is just terrible. However, you obviously just cannot look at that, especially when you're talking about something like the subject matter that this takes place in. As I said, this guy is an aging porn star who gets a sort of once in a lifetime deal that's going to mean that he can sort of leave the industry altogether and he can look after his family. And one of the things that I think is important to notice early on in this film is they do kind of portray our main character here, Milos, sorry. We do sort of portray Milos as being someone who is a kind of family orientated, despite the fact that he might have, you know, what is seen to be a more sort of taboo job. Obviously there's no shaming sex workers here, but you know, that's something that can lead to being less acceptable by society. But he does appear to be, you know, a good family man. He appears to be a good dad. And I think that was an important thing to do in terms of how they're going for this movie tonally, in terms of trying to make us feel some sort of sympathy for Milos. However, obviously, as the film goes on, you know, and the things that we see, look, I'm just going to cut to the chase. There are things that you see in this movie that you should never ever see in any movie. There's, like I say, I'm not going to go into it in great detail. If you're even remotely familiar with a Serbian film, you're going to 100% know. There are podcasts and shows out there that will completely refuse to talk about this movie, to cover this movie, and I very much respect the rights of those podcasts to do that. There are people out there who refuse to watch this movie because of its subject matter, and again, they are absolutely 100% well within their right to do that. I watched this movie for the purposes of this episode, and, you know, it's a movie that I'm never ever going to watch again. It's a movie that I'm never ever going to recommend that people watch. And that is 100% down to some of the subject matter that we see. You know, there's things on there that I wish there's things on there that I wish I could sort of scrub from my brain, and unfortunately, that I'm never ever going to be able to do that. And you know, I think the problem is that you see too much. I think had this film been a little bit more suggestive in some of its subject matter, it would have still been highly controversial. It still would have caused, you know, there'll still be people out there who refuse to see it. Um, but I feel like it might have just gotten a little bit more leeway, but it shows you things really explicitly, things that you don't want to see. You don't want to see. I don't care. You just don't want to see. And if you do want to see them, then you know there's stuff that I think you should probably um work through. So for me, there's really not a lot of redemption when it comes to this movie, in spite of the fact that, like I said earlier, there are positive technical aspects to this movie. Like I say, the acting's fine, the script is fine. You know, the gore itself is good. Like the effects are good. The soundtrack is really cool, but you cannot look at those things in isolation without giving a wider overview and taking into account what the actual subject matter for this movie is. Like, you just can't. It's impossible to do so. You know, the film there's a bit of a pacing issue with the film for me. It kind of obviously tries to build up to the big scene, and by the big scene, I think there's two, really. There's two scenes in this movie that take things way beyond the pale. We've all seen rape revenge films, and we're not trying to sort of minimize the impact of that, absolutely 100%, but we've all seen, well, maybe we haven't all seen, but we're all aware of things like I Spit on Your Grave, Revenge, and countless other ones out there. You know, having those things in your horror film will alienate a portion of your audience. It absolutely will. It just will. If that's the subject matter of your film, there will be a portion of the audience who just simply do not want to see it, who may have been affected by it, and therefore don't want to see it as well. And so that is an automatic thing when it's going to come to a Serbian film. We all know that that's the kind of subject matter that we're talking about here. However, when you take it to that next level, when you take it to necrophilia, when you take it to paedophilia, then you're probably alienating 99% of your audience, because we just don't want to see it. The only reason I've watched this movie is for the purposes of this review, and you know, just to sort of get to get my thoughts out there. You know, like that's essentially it. I didn't garner any enjoyment at all from watching this movie. So, like I say, there's some good technical aspects to it, but the subject matter just means that I'm never ever going to recommend this movie. And you know, going on, this movie has been banned, I think, the last time I counted, I think it was at 46 countries. They were actually going to show this movie at the Cannes Film Festival, but they because it was so controversial, get this, they replaced it with the film Buried, that movie where Ryan Reynolds is buried alive underground. So tonally, I don't think you could have gone much different from, you know, Ryan Reynolds in a serious role, albeit, but you know, that's a very, very different type of movie to this. We'll go on to do some ratings. Like I said, it's going to be just a quick short episode. We'll do the critics. IMDb scored this a 5 out of 10. I'm surprised they were as high as that. And, you know, like, I think I was a little surprised at how high a lot of these scores were. There was no Metacritic score, but the Rotten Tomatoes critics give it 47%. The Rotten Tomatoes audience give it 43%. We always throw it out to our audience and listeners and ask for their scores. On average, you guys gave it a 3.5, so you're definitely the lowest out of there. Critics' consensus: a pointless shocker and societal allegory, a film whose imagery is so gruesome as to leave you scarred for life or rolling your eyes for 100 minutes. I think that's a couple of the other points there as well, right? Because obviously this movie is trying to have some sort of social commentary about, you know, life in Serbia and be symbolic and things like that, but it's so grim and so gruesome that any points I think this movie even tries to have just gets lost, 100% lost in the subject matter, that it loses any impact that it potentially has to have. And then again, you've got the fact that this movie is 100 minutes long, and it's a long movie of sheer grimness. It just brutality and gruesomeness. And I feel like this would have been a great film to have as one of those sort of shorter style films, you know, like, and obviously again tonally we're not comparing these films 100%, but you know, like Host was an hour long. You look at things like Wreck, it's like an hour and 10 minutes. Like, this movie should have been that length. This should not have been a movie that's an hour and 40 minutes. Absolutely not. This cut half an hour out of this movie, 100%. So like I say, you guys giving it a 3.5. We'll go through some of our your opinions. Our friend Boomer over at the Podcast in the Woods says the most uncomfortable 8 out of 10 in cinema history for me. It's a good movie, but one I'll probably never watch again. The Wrestling and Beer Guru gives it a 0. It's just a vile, fake snuff film. It's not a horror movie. It's just an exercise in endurance. If you haven't seen it, don't bother. Bad Poet Society says, I'd say a 5. Worst parts were the infamous newborn porn and the finale. Otherwise, if it didn't have those scenes, it would be your run-of-the-mill extreme movie. The ending is devastating. I've seen it once, and that's enough. However, the theme song slaps, though. That's fair. Dodger Thorn says, I can't endorse this. 0. Our friend Ren gives, I want to give it a 0, but I cannot. It's probably more in line with a 7 out of 10. I think it's acted and shot very well. I love the idea of retracing steps through a series of videotapes. However, I think had they chose another route to explain how much life in Serbia is awful, they would have had a better replay value for most people. Choosing to be abhorrently grotesque sexually undercuts their message because it's too extreme. There is 0 replay value in this for me. And finally, Moon Wind Star Dancer also gives it a 0 for its disgustingness and poor execution. And I think, you know, that there is obviously just a snapshot of how people feel about this movie, but it's a very valid and valuable snapshot. Ultimately, this is just too extreme for what it's trying to say. This movie is trying to say, it's trying to have social commentary, it's trying to be metaphorical, but it's just too extreme, and the message gets lost in the grotesque and the violentness. Like, this is, it's a miss. It's a hit and a miss, and I can't condone the things that I see in this film, despite the fact that I have said that there's some positives to go in this film, and like I say, there are. This has been shot well. I think the acting's fine, the script's fine, I think the soundtrack is fine. Again, you know, I'll repeat those points. There are positive aspects to the film, but I think that the fact that I am giving it that praise makes the score that I'm going to give it all the more impactful, because I'm giving this a 0. This is a 0 out of 10 for me, simply purely because of it's just how extreme it is. And I know full well that there are far more extreme horror movies out there than a Serbian film. I know there are. And I know that section of horror absolutely has its fan base, and if that's what you're into, then, you know, peace be with you. But for me, I don't want to see things like this on my screen. I have no interest in it. So for me, it's a 0. You know, you can see, like my t-shirt is a Halloween t-shirt. You know, that's these are the kind of horror films that I like. Like I say, I'm not judging anyone on their opinions on horror films. We will never ever tell anyone how to feel about a horror movie on this channel, on this podcast. But, you know, if someone came to me and says, "Oh, would you recommend going to see this?" it would be a resounding no. The subject matter is just way too out there for me. I can't with this film. So that's going to do it for my very brief overview and review of a Serbian film. Don't forget, if you want to support us, you can do so across our social medias. We are on Twitter at Damn Podcast. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram, Podcast of the Damn. Obviously, we're here on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, please go hit that subscribe button. Follow us, check out some of our older videos. Don't forget, all of the content that you see here on YouTube will also be available on our Patreon. You will get early access to all of our YouTube content on Patreon. So check that out, patreon.com/Pod of the Damned as well. The next mini review on this channel will be a very different movie. We're going to be reviewing Last Night in Soho, so that's going to be our next mini review. But do go back and check some of our older ones. We've done Scream and Texas Chainsaw Massacre from earlier this year. We've also got a mini review up on our Patreon of Pieces as well, the old Italian film. So please go check those out as well. Obviously, you've got this one. Next time's going to be Last Night in Soho, so please do go check those out as well. We've also got a remake review of Rob Zombie's Halloween up here as well. So there's loads of content. Check out the main show. Brand new episode released on the main show every single Tuesday. This week was An American Werewolf in London. Next week's going to be The Human Centipede. So there's always loads and loads of content coming out. And of course, check out my own personal Twitch channel, which you can see at the top is at spooky_forest, where I play horror games and more. But guys, thank you so much for listening, liking, tuning in, following, and all of the above. I do appreciate all of your support. And don't forget, on the podcast of the damned, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.